I can do no wrong, for I do not know what it is.
You murdered him.
Never mind. Life itself is only a vision, a dream. Nothing exists save empty space, and you are but a thought.
Thou globby bottle of cheap, stinking chip oil! Come and get one in the yarbles! If you have any yarbles, you eunuch jelly thou!
And what's so stinking about it?
It's a stinking word because there's no law and order anymore. It's a stinking word because it lets the young get onto the old. Good you dog. Oh, it's no order for an old man any longer.
To compare two pieces of dystopian fiction to see how accurately authors of a past generation were able to predict the depression that skewers and holds Gen Z hostage. Now, Clockwork Orange is a dark yet vibrant kaleidoscope of violence, free will, morality, and uncertainty. It's a dystopian what-if that breeds characters of unimagined sin for an environment that represents the absurd. Author Anthony Burgess, raised a Catholic, reflects in his text the belief that we are all tainted with original sin. He abandons religious and moral principles to perpetuate the evil of man, thus exposing life's inconsequentiality, and this, I believe, was inspired by his self-described agony he endured upon questioning his faith at age 17. Published in 1916, 46 years before Clockwork Orange, we have a dark commentary and deconstruction of religion written by Mark Twain. The Mysterious Stranger is a satire that is not concerned with ethical reform. It is a nihilistic and solipsistic work that was described by historian Bernard DeVoto as a coping mechanism for Twain, preventing him from slipping into madness late in life. This opinion can be justified when comparing The Mysterious Stranger to Twain's earlier work, for example, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which contained more uplifting themes of freedom and individual conscience. The novel's enforcement of the belief in meaninglessness is what changes and challenges the minds of the young characters. In each of these books we are presented with a nihilistic environment that encourages mental solitude and influences the behaviour of society's youths, for example the lust of violence in A Clockwork Orange, or the Three Boys' endorsement of supernatural in The Mysterious Stranger. Both authors use these environments to create ironic and satirical consequences. The characters are looked down upon and scolded by the societies who neglected and thus created them. This teaches the reader how in both books, to reject accountability and thus meaning in one's life is the only way to become free from judgment, and thus free from sin. The youth are surviving in worlds created by others, and in turn must be punished for how they appropriately respond to their situations. For example, Nicholas's death in The Mysterious Stranger is ironically triggered by Theodore and Seppi attempting to prevent his fate upon learning of his prediction. In A Clockwork Orange, society is bland and barren. A soulless urban environment is depicted in Chapter 2 when flat blocks like mountains are emitting blue light from nearly everyone watching the exact same worldcast on television. On top of this, with corruption amongst authority lit throughout, primarily demonstrated through police brutality, the apparent freedom of choice by which Alex and his droogs commit unspeakable acts is actually a reflection of a lack of moral choice that renders humans blameless. With the only catharsis to express her abandonment is through destruction, and the Nadsat language among youths is a creation deliberately unobtainable and non-relatable to the rest of society. Its supposed meaninglessness only exists due to the moral husk the society has given it habitat for. Burgess is revealing how youths are littered in another generation's world, and they will only respect it when society recognises and gives respect to the youth. Much like how Twain reveals that Satan and his nihilistic dogma is all that makes sense to Theodore and his friends, as the rest of society leaves them without answers in a world that the youths did not create nor can properly understand. Burgess starts each of his novels' three parts with the same recurring motif. What's it going to be, Vinay? As well as repeating this question throughout the chapters, what's interesting is that while the phrase's exact wording is preserved in each instance of its appearance, its meaning is never truly repeated. The question is used in a wide variety of contexts and asked by different characters. Burgess shows versatility within the phrase to enforce how there is no familiarity and definitive certainty in the story. Society is asking the same question expecting different answers. It's the first example of nihilism that we are introduced to, without the reader initially realizing, and is an overarching reminder of the monotony within uncertainty, thus adding to the meaninglessness of the dystopia that engulfs and shapes the story. This identical phrase is always answered with the premise of demise. For example, Alex's anticipation of a night of ultraviolence, the prison chaplain addressing the punishment of a group of terrible inmates, as well as concerning the uncertainty of Alex's fate in prison. As the reader comes to learn how the ending's demise are guaranteed, they progressively understand the life of Alex, a developing mind trapped in a world that never develops. The end result is a product of misery, thus the events leading up to it have no value. We understand how the nihilistic setting is what perpetuates the young mind to be unable to relate and thus unable to care for his actions. Burgess's crucial opening phrase of "what's it going to be, Vinay?" points us to the lack of inherent value or orientation in the pre-existing landscape. In the opening chapter, Alex discusses making up their minds, indicating that nothing worthwhile seems to be forthcoming and thus that it is left to Alex and his gang to make up meaning and worth. As an opening gambit, this is both a challenge to the reader but also a description of late 20th century existence as Burgess sees it. This foregrounding of a vacuum puts us into the realm of nihilism and also allows for the possibility of a whole new set of values. Alex's culture of violence, classical music, the Beauce dialect are systems that he regards to have grand meaning. He incorporates them into his life to try and make sense of a world that's given him nothing else. Alex is presented as the paradigm of the re-evaluator of all values, his impetuous and psychotic actions becoming the new criterion for truth amongst the youth gangs. In this, Alex and his droogs are the prime example of youth existing in a world of nihilism. And much like Theodore and his friends, the lack of consequence of the youth's actions, both good and bad, paints an even more disturbing picture of society. In both texts, this leaves the reader with a curious sense of dread. We are left wondering if these youths are making no impact on dying societies despite their incredibly destructive and constructive efforts. How will society evolve when this generation takes over? As touched upon earlier, Twain's novella explores weighty meaning of life issues, providing a vehicle to examine the thinking of Twain as an elderly man, who expressed his unrestrained philosophical and religious views as he reflected on the multiple tragedies of his life and confronted the imminence of his own mortality. The dawning realization of a close death is represented through the criticism of the corrupt moral sense, and how he believes that only when life is meaningless, man may not suffer nor sin. Thus, his three teenage characters of Theodore, Seppi, and Nikolaus progressively reject base human emotions as Satan further disconnects them from their world, as negative emotions may only exist alongside positive ones. In a similar vein, both authors employ this moral dilemma to display that it is better to have free will and suffer because of it, than to be logical and unfeeling. These two texts warn that we must not attempt to control the young mindset, as this deconstructs meaning and relationships amongst them, thus pushing nihilism in their faces and ironically, giving youths no reason to want to listen or abide by the rules set by higher society. Philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche believed that nihilism is rooted in the lack of moral interpretations of society. He went on to argue that nihilism rejects all forms and embodiments of value and purpose, as these are only human desires, meaning that these concepts are artificial on the natural habitat of Earth and the universe. In his work Beyond Good and Evil, he states, "It is terrible to die of thirst in the ocean, so do you have to salt your truth to the point where it doesn't quench thirst anymore." Nietzsche condemns the false interpretations of the world, believing that attempting to make sense of powers you don't understand leads to further meaninglessness in life. Using this analysis of human behaviour, we can appropriately determine that both authors do not wish to show their youthful generations as practitioners of nihilism. A Clockwork Orange, a novel entirely dictated by Alex, is riddled with the aforementioned slang language that makes it a completely uniquely read novel. The Mysterious Stranger is heavily laced with the narrator's lament of his current situation. In Chapter 3, when Theodore states our hearts were broken, we could not keep from crying, it is clear that he is fond of the attachments he has to this world. These authors make it apparent to their audiences that the youth generation has a desire for meaning, and they are not the cause of nihilism, but become consumed by it when it approaches them and shapes their lives. The narrator of The Mysterious Stranger is Theodore Fisher, a 16-year-old apprentice of a printer. While briefly mentioned, his role as apprentice is crucial to the nihilism presented in the story. In 1590s Austria, the introduction of the Gutenberg printing press was the most advanced press available. Theodore is revealed to be a sole conscience of the world that he has created, as a bookmaker creates worlds through printing. He's left absolutely alone in space, and the reader witnesses his isolation and so is saddened by the companionship that Theodore must never have, as is asserted by Twain and his Socratic dialogue. Now, I find that this links to Albert Camus' 1951 philosophical essay, The Rebel, in which Camus states that only when there is a rejection of ethical positions is there a rebellion. A man who says no, but whose refusal does not imply renunciation, he is also a man who says yes, from the moment that he makes his first gesture of rebellion. True, ultimate freedom only happens when you relinquish the idea of purpose, as purpose alludes to historical standards of humanity. The rebel must challenge what our limits and standards are. When we challenge that, we find meaning. To freely live your life, you must dedicate it to yourself and your own beliefs, such as reflected in the novella by the youths constantly criticising and pleading against Satan's lack of compassion. Twain has these boys represent rebellion in the name of what they believed in. I begged him to be more considerate and stop making people unhappy. And when Theodore is unable to assuage or change Satan's views, he is left in a state of utter nihilism, finding himself completely without purpose. Twain ends the novella with the open-ended question of whether or not Theodore is now truly free, as philosophers such as Camus would suggest. Regardless, as is similar with Burgess's fictional Ludovico technique, the end result is that by stripping away human morality, what Twain dubs as moral sense, may result in freedom of a literal sense, but renders the victim completely unhappy. Both texts show youths disconnected from their worlds when confronted with their nihilistic settings, as they're rendered incapable of experiencing true happiness without purpose. The mysterious stranger is narrated in the first-person voice, thus all of the events of the story are related solely from Theodore's point of view. This limited first-person narrative point of view is central to the story. As previously mentioned, the ending asserts that everything in Theodore's universe is a creation of his own imagination, so it is entirely possible that he has merely imagined these people, places and events, or even that the entire story is a dream from which he will soon awaken. Similarly, A Clockwork Orange is narrated by Alex across his late teenage years. We are treated to an insightful yet delirious projection of how Alex uniquely perceives the world and the many ways in which he challenges it. The two narrators are living in worlds questioned and belittled by their peers. The two youths, both left without mental clarity, desperately trying to make sense of their situations. The irony of Alex referring to the name home for a rural cottage as a gloopy sort of name shows how, due to the lack of consequence and purpose in his life, he is still looking for home. He refers to himself as the large to show how his ego attempts to compensate for a lack of meaning in his life. In The Mysterious Stranger, Theodore, upon hearing the prediction of Nicolaus's death, states that it would shock me to hear Nicolaus laugh, for to me he would be a corpse. These two authors employ first-person narration to display how detached both narrators become from their worlds. They are left longing for more in their life, yet unable to achieve it. Alex attempts to rectify the meaninglessness in his world by the constant hyperbolic epithets he tries to convince the reader and himself with. For example, humble, friend, large, wise, yet we see his actions contradict the nature he advertises himself as. Unlike this, the narrator of The Mysterious Stranger is oft in denial of Satan's disregard of principles and morals that the meaning of Theodore's world has been entirely based upon. He often states that Satan would not understand, yet at the end of the novella he reveals he was left appalled, for he knew and realised that all Satan had said was true. The narration of both stories enables the reader to emphasise and realise how meaning is unique for each person and almost never extends out of one's own psyche. When introduced to a truly perfect character, one who is considered to be above the moral sense and so is without sin, Theodore recognises that this character, Satan, is incapable of relating to human emotion. Satan knows it, but only through intelligence, no experience of it. Yet Satan appears to try and dictate the principles of human emotion, frustrated when exclaiming sanity and happiness are an impossible combination. No sane man can be happy, for to him life is real. Mark Twain is expressing his own thoughts through this dialogue, encouraged by the depression he was experiencing at the end of his life. It's obvious that Theodore chooses for life to not be real at the end of the story, as he has learned through Satan that any other possibility of his world would be without meaning. Theodore's actions are a result of embracing that to exist has as much meaning as to not exist, identifying how Satan did not seem to know any way to do a person a kindness but by killing him. Similarly, Anthony Burgess recognises how, without conflict, we have no life at all, a statement which aligns with the thoughts of Camus extracted from The Rebel. It is clear how in these two stories the authors wish to display how life becomes meaningless when it is stripped of morality and made perfect. The nihilism in these stories warrants unorthodox and questioning behaviour of the youths as they attempt to exist in a world that wishes to flush out imperfections. Novelist Sir Kingsley Amis states that Clockwork Orange's greatest appeal is that it is a big laugh, in which what we ordinarily think of as sadism plays little part, and thus it is apparent that Burgess successfully, through the narration of Alex, is able to convey his thoughts on the meaninglessness of morality. His actions are not done in the name of sadistic intent, but rather of a result of needing entertainment and fulfillment in a meaningless dystopia. Sir Christopher Ricks states how the ugliness of aversion therapy is relevant to the publication era of the novel, a time when homosexuals could be considered cured of their disease. This relates to how the novel establishes the demarcation between truth and illusion, or truth in appearance, and raises the issue of whether we can have a knowledge for such distinction without inane and crass discrimination, much like that took place to those whom were prescribed aversion therapy. This may also relate to Plato's allegory of the cave, a philosophical and nihilistic dialogue. It's apparent to see that a nihilistic society within the novel leaves youths with the inability to distinguish any moral sense, as well as the incapability to mature until they find a purpose in life. An example of this is how Pete, one of Alex's old gang members, was all grown up in the final chapter of the novel after falling in love with a woman. He had grown attachment to something within the world, and thus was no longer the victim of the world without meaning. To conclude, both authors incorporate concepts of nihilism that were relevant to the then current environments each author had to live in. For example, Mark Twain's depression and lack of motivation that consumed his dying years, and Anthony Burgess's exposure to hostility by the government, and in turn how adolescents and young adults would react to it. These concepts are challenged and deconstructed for the purpose of displaying how to have meaning in the world. Higher powers must not attempt to demean human nature to worthlessness. The youth narrators in these novels are actually both imagining the fantasy world they live in as a result of being left unstimulated by the seeming meaninglessness of what already exists for them. The two texts display the downfall of youth society through different inclusions of nihilism. A Clockwork Orange shows youths born into a world of nihilism, never knowing a society that would include nor care for them, and thus they desperately attempt to eradicate the nihilism they're confronted by. On the other hand, in the world of the mysterious stranger, Twain presents a world where nihilism is not present from the start of the youth's lives, but rather introduced as they approach the age of independence. The boys, like Burgess's Drews, desperately attempt to attach meaning to their world when introduced to nihilism. The two texts show different outcomes for their young generation, however, with A Clockwork Orange stating that when youths are forced to live in a society without meaning, they react by challenging authority in order to establish whatever boundaries they're breaking, in turn giving meaning to the lives they live out. The youth and the mysterious stranger do not fight against what they do not understand, but lament the questioning of morality in life until there is literally nothing of meaning for them. These texts are insightful to the minds of the ever-changing youth generation. When authority, society, and artwork does not care nor include them, they feel abandoned and that life has no meaning. Living a life of nihilism as their minds develop, as demonstrated by both authors, delves a young mind into madness.
Man, I think I am. And I'm not a woman man can stand. Bigger than a teen boy's testosterone can't be held in these little girl hands. A phallic protection, a 6-foot frame and a huge fist objection. Woman to the core, what I want so bad. Iron rubber, shoulders broad and chest a deserted desert plain. But I don't feel much better, still can't fit the frame.